All right, well, welcome to our first webinar of this month, Setting Climate Aligned Targets. I'm Nadine France, I'm the Marketing Manager at Toitū Envirocare, and really thrilled to have so many people tune in this Tuesday morning. Just a few pieces of housekeeping before I pass over to Ronja. Firstly, just note that you are on mute on joining, and that's just to minimise the background noise. We do, however, have a Q&A function, so please send through any questions via that function throughout the piece, and then Ronja will be doing a Q&A session at the end of her presentation. We also have a chat function where you can make commentary if you'd like. If we can't answer your question in the time available, we will be in touch by email afterwards. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website within the next day or so as well. Just if you do have any technical issues, we recommend that first you check your computer and your headset. It might just be you need to turn up your volume. If you do have more issues than that, recommend that you close out of the webinar and rejoin. That seems to solve the vast majority of issues, though I hope we're not going to have any. And with that, I'd like to pass over to Ronja. So Ronja is our Technical Account Manager. She's an expert in all things carbon. She's based in Wellington and she works across a wide variety of industries, including the public and private sectors. And so really looking forward to her presentation this morning. Over to you, Ronja.
And welcome everyone. Who we are, for those of you who might not have. So we're Toitū Envirocare, and we're a subsidiary of Manaki Whenua Landcare Research. And we're 100% owned by Manaki Whenua, and we are probably most famous for our carbon reduce and carbon zero programs. But we also work with quite a lot of organizations via the Achilles Group in the UK. And we also run the Envirocare program. And we also help some of our organizations setting targets, and that's driven today's webinar. We get a lot of questions around how do we set targets, what should we think about, what's a climate aligned target, and what's a science-based targets, and are they the same? So today's webinar, I'm hoping to cover off and clear out all questions. Please, as Nadine said, if you have any questions, just drop them into the question box and I'll hopefully answer them at the end, or what I'll do is I'll get a written response to you later on. And so today what we're going to cover is what is a climate aligned carbon reduction target and how to set one, and some of the ins and outs to think about. This is relevant for small enterprise, large enterprise, medium enterprise, but also government organizations. And I will cover some of the differences and what to think about depending on what particular organization you might be working with. But just very, very quickly on where the term science-based target and climate aligned target has come from in the first place. And you all will be aware of the Paris Agreement that set reduction targets for or I should say ambition for nations. There was quite a lot of realization that with the policies, so you'll see my screen here, with current policies, optimistic policies, we still would not be able to get down to the 2 degrees, preferred 1.5 degrees, as recommended by the IPCC report with policy only. And so therefore businesses in particular, but also some government organizations around the globe started thinking about how could they reduce their emissions to be part of this and to make sure that we actually meet our what is absolutely necessary in terms of meeting the 2 degree at least global warming or limiting global warming prehistorical industrial times. And so that's driven both governments and businesses, so governments and nations under the Paris Agreement, but then you'd also see organizations in the public sector and businesses alike setting targets that are aligned with what's required from a global perspective. So you would have seen targets like ambitious to become carbon zero by 2040, by 2030. You would have heard about the New Zealand Zero Carbon Bill. And these are all aligned with the IPCC report and what's required for either a well below 2 degrees or a 1.5 degree warming. And we'll get into some of the details and what the difference is and what that means in a second. One organization that has driven a lot of the business sector in terms of setting science-based targets is the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is I guess a joint initiative between the WWF, the CDP, the UN Global Compact, and World Resource Institute. And so what they did was, when they realized that organizations need to bring in their bit as well on reducing carbon emissions, it's a joint this is a joint effort. We can't just rely on governments. We need to rely on consumers and businesses and public sector. Everyone needs to come together to reduce. And so they developed some guidance on how businesses and organizations can set targets that are aligned with what the IPCC report recommends. And so a lot of their recommendations and things that I will cover today will be a reflection of what's in the Science-Based Target Initiative guidance. I'll give you some resources of where to find more information, where you can find this information yourselves, and some reports, etc. So I should actually just quickly say as well, so one big thing that distinguishes a science-based target from, I guess, the traditional targets is ambitious. And they are ambitious. They are focusing on what needs to happen rather than what you think you can achieve by pulling together a few initiatives here and there. That's a really key, important part, because a lot of organizations, once they start digging into what a science-based target would mean for them, they realize that it's going to take a lot of different activities, actions, initiatives, investments, and integration into business as usual. And so that's just really keep that in mind. That's a very big key word when it comes to science-based targets or climate-aligned targets. And I've got a little bit of an overview of what are some of the main differences that we see. If you look at what a climate aligned or science-based target, I should say, I'll use them interchangeably. And these are some of the things that we see are the main differences. So really, the key is ambitious and that they are based on what we need to achieve, and I guess scientific evaluation of what is needed globally. And then we bring that down to an organizational level. It also focuses on your scope 1 and 2 and your scope 3 emissions. We'll look into that a little bit and how that works from a practical perspective and for you to set a target. It does put a lot of emphasis on the supply chain emissions. So that's also something where we get a lot of questions and where we see a lot of organizations struggle. So hopefully I can clear out some of the bits around that. This is also another key factor. They should be between 5. Of course, longer term targets are also it's also one very important factor to remember. So those are some of the key changes. So I'm actually going to jump straight to you do. So first of all, what you need to do is you need to make sure that you have a robust baseline or base year inventory. If you don't already, I would recommend you go into either the MFE workbooks. They have some easy to use workbooks there that you can fill in your activity data, and it will show you what your emissions are, and it will split it out by the different scopes. Also, you could potentially also use the UK DEFRA. They are both linked here, and they will be in the notes. A very similar tool, but it's based on UK emission factors, whereas obviously the MFE, Ministry for the Environment, New Zealand's factors are based on New Zealand data. Or if you're in the Carbon Reduce or the Carbon Zero program, or you've had your inventory verified to the ISO 14064 standard, you probably already have everything you need from the get-go. You might also have developed your inventory to the greenhouse gas protocol, and if you haven't, so I would recommend you look at either the ISO standard or the greenhouse gas protocol, and you work out what your baseline emissions are. These should be preferably from a 1 year perspective, and I would recommend you choose a year that is as close to current times as possible. So that is number one. So make sure you understand what your emissions are. And if you are in this position where you might have good oversight of your scope 1 and 2 emissions, but not yet your scope 3 emissions, I would say that is not necessarily a roadblock for you. You can still evaluate what your scope 1 and 2 targets could be, and then set up a work plan for how you might estimate what your scope 3 emissions are. So let's say that you have your scope 1 and 2 emissions. I have included a little screenshot here of some example scope 1 and 2 breakdowns. If you were going to do this from the absolute easiest way, you'd go into the Science Based Target Initiative's website, you plug in what your base year is, what your target year is. Remember, that should be anywhere from 5 to 15 years. And you then fill in what your scope 1 emissions are and what your scope 2 emissions are. This is just I guess a very easy, clear way to just get an indication of what your target for your scope 1 and 2 emissions potentially might be. If you are in a particular sector, there are some sector tools, but I'm going to start off by just covering on what your absolute reductions could look like. So what you've got in front of you here, I've just screenshotted the science-based target tool. And so what it has done is shows me what my emissions are in the base year, and then what they should be in the target year, and what that means in terms of reduction in percentages. And as you'll see here, I've got the well below 2 degree scenario, and I've got the 1.5 degree scenario. And as you'll note, it is quite significant in terms of reduction. And those are the two pathways. This will give you in terms of percentage reduction required, but what you can also do then, so once you've done this, you could then plot this on a graph, for example. I hope everyone can still hear me. It tells me I'm a bit unstable in terms of internet connection. So you can then map out what you think that your emissions are. You might already have a target to reduce your diesel, replace so if you have those, you could plot them in and say, well, at the moment, and then of course what below 2 degree pathway and the 1.5 degree pathway. Of course, as long as your organization or your reduction pathway for your organization is well below the 2 degree pathway here, you could essentially say that your scope 1 and 2 target is aligned with climate science. But we are going to go into the scope 3 emissions as well. I've come across quite an interesting way of putting it in a different webinar a few weeks ago, where they said, well, the well below 2 degrees, it's your trigger for your organization to innovate. And your 1.5 degrees for poker players, it's the all in terms of climate action. And what it means really is that if you are a sustainability person, or you are in charge of driving reductions in your organizations, if you get a 1.5 degree target signed off as an okay for your management, well, you essentially then hopefully will have a much easier way in getting funding and implementing and carbon reduction activities, but some time and resource earmarked for it. I speak a little bit about what we've seen organizations do. In particular, if they get this signed off, it's kind of their way to engagement internally, because they can then say, well, we've signed off on work on this. So, and others like to have a more engaged approach where you have multiple sign off. So but I think that for a lot of organizations, setting an ambitious target can often help the person or the people in charge of sustainability, because it will show, well, we have actually said this publicly, and we now have to work towards this. So it can work two ways. It can work in the sense of realizing what you might need to do to be a, I guess, climate smart business in terms of reductions, but then it could also be that tool that you need to say, well, we've said that we're going to reduce this much. Let's get on with it. Another way of yes.
Ronja, we've just had a quick question through, which might be relevant. Could you give a really quick definition for each scope? So what you mean by scope 1, 2, and 3?
Yes. Sorry. So your scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions. So that is, for example, the diesel that your vehicle. It can be natural gas used in your buildings. Direct emissions. They are often associated with control. So when I say control of how you use that fuel and in charge of the emissions that fuel. And scope 2 emissions are your electricity emissions, also any purchased steam. For a lot of organizations in New Zealand, your scope 1 emissions are a little bit higher than your scope 2 unless you have a lot of property. And your scope 3 emissions are your indirect emissions. So those are associated to the services or the products that you purchase as an organization. So essentially your scope 1 and 2 emissions are emitted by your organization, whereas your scope 3 emissions are from a third party but associated to the purchase services and goods of your organization. And I should say the large focus on the scope 1 and 2 as a first one is because of that level of control. Is for your organization to realize that you have control of some of the direct emissions that you emit. And so it is essentially your responsibility then as well to reduce those emissions. And where we walk into the scope 3 area, of course, there will be a lot more supplier and supply chain engagement, and you might have to collaborate with other actors to reduce those emissions. So we'll dig into the scope 3s in a second, but hopefully that covers a little bit what the scope 1 and 2 emissions are. And if you want more information on that, I would recommend you go into the greenhouse gas protocol. And there is a manual there that describes all different emission sources and what category they should be classified. And the scopes, I should say as well, so that when we speak about scopes from a greenhouse gas accounting perspective, those are the same in both the greenhouse gas protocol and the ISO 14064 2006 version. So if you want to know more about that, I recommend you go in and have a look there. And also, if you are using the Ministry for the Environment's workbook, it would automatically classify the scopes for you there as well. So that can be quite useful. And so you can look at it from this perspective. I do find a lot of organizations find it useful to use graphs like this when you speak to management and when you want to, I guess, populate the idea internally. Another way of looking at it is potentially look at your business as usual, looking at what's the reduction pathway that you need to or want to be on, and what are some of the activities in between. Essentially, the space in between here is what you want to try to reduce, and it's about working on the pathway of reducing your emissions there. In this case here, business as usual, you've combined up your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And I should go back here quickly and show you. So the tool here has obviously, they show you the emissions per scope, so your scope 1 and 2, but it also shows you the combined scope 1 and 2. So most organizations prefer to talk to them as a combined scope 1 and 2, but it doesn't have that split as well. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way you could potentially do is that you split out your sources. So here I've got some example sources of scope 1 and 2 emissions. There are a few scope 3 at the bottom, but just looking at the scope 1 and 2 emissions, you have essentially measured what the tons of CO2 equivalents are for those sources. And then what you do is you internally, or if you have quite good oversight of your your business already or your organization already, you might choose to sit down and have a little think about what you think some of the reductions year on year might be. Keeping in mind when we look at reductions like this, there is very, very, very seldom a straight line reduction pathway. So there is, I guess you very often see spaces where there might not be any reductions for a couple of years. You might also see that there is no reductions for the first 5 years, but you know that you have a vehicle fleet renewal coming up in, say, 5 years' time. So that might sit as 0 reductions until then, but then in 2025 you start reducing some of those emissions. And breaking it down by source like this can make it a little bit easier, especially if you're a team and you're wanting to try to understand what are our sources and where can we reduce. So it just essentially breaks it down a little bit more on a granular level. When you look at your scope 1 and 2 emissions, we often say that if you're on a 5 to 15 year time frame, you want to look at a 2.5% reduction per year if you want to be aligned with the well below 2 degrees pathways, and a 4.2% reduction year on year if you're on a 1.5 degree pathway within that 5 to 15 year time frame. So that just as another way of looking at it as well. So essentially, you just want to understand what your scope 1 and 2 emissions are, plug in either by using the science-based target tool or calculating, if you're keeping the 5 to 15 year time frame, calculate what a 2.5% or a 4.2% on an annual basis would mean in terms of reductions for you. So that is your scope 1 and 2 part done. You also want to make sure that you are covering all of your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that's why the greenhouse gas protocol or the ISO standard will help you guide you through that if you're not in the, say, the carbon reduce or carbon zero programs, or if you haven't had your inventory verified. So have a look at that. You then want to understand what your scope 3 emissions are. And the reason why you want to understand that is because very often organizations have quite significant scope 3 emissions. So your scope 3 emissions are, for example, your waste, your business travel, and your freight. Those are some of the examples of your scope 3 emissions. And they can very often be a significant part of your total footprint. And sometimes they are going to be a lot larger than what your scope 1 and 2 emissions are. And that's particularly relevant here in New Zealand. We see a lot of organizations with very significant scope 3 emissions. And so the case that I've got here, we've got the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then as you see here, the scope 3 emissions are larger than the scope 1 and 2. So if you are in the, say, the carbon reduce or carbon zero program, you have already looked at some of your scope 3 emissions. So you would have looked at your freight, business travel, and your waste to landfill. But what you want to make sure is that you have had a look at your total scope 3 emissions. If you have already evaluated what your scope 3 emissions are based on the greenhouse gas protocol, which is the bottom right table here, which is 15 supply chain categories, then you're already one step ahead, and you can just hold it for 2 seconds and we'll move on to what you should be doing next. I have also split in here, this is the ISO standard 2018 version breakdown as well. So if you have already gone on to that, and you want to just make sure you double check the greenhouse gas protocol to understand the difference in the categories there. So what is a scope 3 screening? Well, essentially what you want to do, so if you have not had your scope 3 emissions verified, I would recommend that you start by looking at your supplier reports for things like your waste to landfill and your air travel and maybe your rental vehicles. There might be some mileage claims in your finance data. You might have some asset registers that will give you some information on what are the assets you've got and are there any potential emitting or greenhouse gas emitting activities within that you have not covered in your inventory just yet. and then of course as well there might be some asset specific fuel use hidden in that. And really the purpose is just to understand what are the indirect emissions associated with you with your business as usual activities. Here at Toitū, when we look at what the scope 3 emissions are apart from the I guess the mandatory programs, so those are mandatory in our carbon reducing carbon zero programs. So those are waste to landfill, business travel, and freight. We then do what we call a screening of your scope 3 emission data. So we might set aside the things that we've actually verified, but the easiest way to do this is to look at your finance. You look at what's our CapEx and OpEx spending within this reporting period, and you assign a emission factor code that's based on dollar figures. And so you do then get an estimate of what your scope 3 emissions are in those categories that you might not have measured just yet. Keep in mind they're estimates, and your targets that we'll get to in a second will reflect that as well. So of course, as soon as you move out from the scope 1 and 2 space, you are going to move into more uncertainty because you are relying on suppliers and I guess indirect data and indirect control of those emissions. So that's just good to keep in mind. So for those who love detail, they might cringe in the scope 3 area because there are challenges with getting information. But what you essentially want to get to is to an understanding of where the main emissions are in your supply chain. So in this sense here, I've just mapped it out. The main emissions are sitting in purchased goods and services and capital goods. Again, these categories here, they're from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So I've linked up to that as well. So you can go and have a look in there. And there is a little bit more information as well on how to do a scope 3 screening. We use an emission factor set from the UK, from the DEFRA dollar spend to emissions factor set. And there is also another set from Motu here in New Zealand that can also be used. And those are available online. But essentially what you want to try to understand is what categories are the largest for us in terms of emissions, and where should we be focusing our efforts. And the reason for that is because the Science Based Target Initiative, they recommend, and if you were actually going to claim that your target is climate aligned, if your scope 3 emissions are estimated to be more than 40% of your total emissions, they say that you should be setting a scope 3 target as well. And that scope 3 target, you want to make sure that you cover off at least 67% of your scope 3 emissions, or your top categories there. So to put that in a different way, I've shown it here, broken down instead by a table of those emission sources. So in this case here, you'd want probably to focus on at least the purchased goods and services category, but potentially the top 3 here. There are a few different ways on deciding what you should focus on here, and I'll cover that in a second as well. But this is very, very important. So if your scope 3 emissions are estimated to be more than 40% of your total footprint, there will be an expectation on you to set a scope 3 target. And the other one that you just want to make sure is that you are covering 67% of your scope 3 emissions, or your top 3 categories, like so here. So in terms of how do you go about this then? So if you have done an estimate on what your scope 3 emissions are, the first thing that you could do then is to have a look at what the science-based target workbook tells you your targets could be. So again, here I've just plugged in a base year of 2019 with a target year of 2030. So I'm in that 15-year, 5 to 15-year time frame, and I've plugged in my total scope 3 emissions in here, and it then shows you what some of your potential target pathways could be. I would recommend that when you look at your scope 3 targets, keep in mind that they don't necessarily have to be science-based in the sense that they have to be a particular reduction in percentage. They should be ambitious, but they're the main part is that you are looking at the well below 2 degrees and the 1.5 pathways for your scope 1 and 2 emissions. But because there is a lot of unknown in the scope 3 and you have less influence and less control, it is recognized as well that setting a fixed numeric target in the scope 3 area can be quite tricky. So we often see what we call supply chain engagement targets there, and I'll show you what those could look like. Before then, though, I just wanted to show you here again, so you could look at, well, this is what our pathway would be in a business as usual scenario, or with the activities that we're doing today. And then look at, okay, well, to close the gap and to be on the pathway that is right for our organization, these are the things that we need to do. And I guess this is, you know, a chicken and hen question. Sometimes you say, well, this is where we need to be. What do we do? Or you go, these are the things that we know we can do. Where would that leave us in terms of reductions within the given time frame? And I see different options there, and everyone, depending on what your organization is like and what your style is, none of them is right or wrong. We are working in the target space, so you are working in the future and in the unknown, so that's good to keep in mind. So when you are looking at targets as well, it can be useful to look at what's the past performance of our organization, what are some of the strategic plans that we've got in place at the moment, what are some of our competitors doing, what are other organizations that say that they have set a science-based target, what have they A, set as a target, and B, are there any things that we could look at doing that are relevant for our organization as well. And then, of course, you know, understanding, is there any optimal sector performance for us? Should we break it down by emissions by, for example, full-time employee? Should we look at per product output? So understanding a little bit more about what your sector is doing can be useful when you look at the targets, and also when you're talking to management or you're trying to get internal buy-in on your target. Quickly as well, mention supplier engagement targets. So this is for your scope 3. So what you can do here is that you say, well, we have done a lot of estimates in our scope 3 area, and so it will be hard for us to say exactly a particular number that we're going to reduce. So as a first step, we're going to try to engage with our supply chain on reducing emissions. And you see here as a level of ambition ladder, I should say, where the best would be if you can get your suppliers to set a climate aligned or a science-based target as well. But you might start off by saying, can we engage with our suppliers? Can we get them to report our scope 1 and 2 emissions? And can we help each other out on sharing knowledge and how to do that? So your target essentially in terms of wording could be something like here, where I've got 2 different examples. You might say, well, we're going to reduce our emissions by 38% by 2030. And then we're going to reduce our 67% of our scope 3 emissions by spend. So they've done here, covering purchased goods and services and capital goods. So those are 2 of the categories in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And they want suppliers within those categories to set science-based targets by 2030. Another example here is to set a 30% reduction for scope 1 and 2 emissions by 2030 from a 2018 base year, but also commit to working with suppliers so that 67% of those have set science-based targets by 2024. The key thing here, if you are setting supplier engagement targets, is to look at 5 years. So when you look at your scope 1 and 2 emissions, those should be between 5 and 15. But when you're looking at, if you are setting a supply chain engagement target for your scope 3 emissions, just make sure you keep that within a 5-year time frame. So just to kind of cover off on some of the key considerations here, make sure you've covered 95% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions, of course, preferably 100%. Start with scope 1 and 2 emissions and set your scope 3 targets separately. You can, of course, combine, so you have a scope 1 and 2 and 3 targets, but you should make sure that your scope 1 and 2 target still aligns with the well below 2 degree or a 1.5 alignment and pathway. The time frame should be 5 to 15 years, and I've got a submission here, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what organizations are doing once they have set a science-based target or a climate-aligned target. And yes, and so your supplier or customer engagement target should cover at least 2/3 to 67% of your total scope 3 emissions. And one key thing here as well is that science-based targets and climate-aligned target do not recognize offsets. So that's a key point. We do get that question quite a lot, and that is because we want to see that organizations are reducing the emissions in the first place. So that's just a very useful thing to note. So I did mention Science-Based Target Initiative early on. So if you're an government organization or within the public sector, unfortunately, the Science-Based Target Initiative does not allow or accept any applications from you. That's not to say that you can't use the guidance and set your target in alignment with the guidance. But if you are a business, you can submit your target to the Science-Based Target Initiative. I would encourage you to go in and have a look on their website, what they're all about and how to do that. There's quite a lot of good guidance in there. And they have very recently released a small enterprise pathway for submitting your target. So it's a bit of a reduced price for submitting. The time frame for getting approval is a bit shorter, and it's a little bit easier than the enterprise tool. So in a small enterprise from the Science-Based Target Initiative's classification is a organization that's less than 500 employees, and that is not a subsidiary of a larger international organization. And so the main thing, the difference between the enterprise and the small enterprise is that for a small enterprise, you set a scope 1 and 2 target, and they want you to measure and reduce your scope 3 emissions, and eventually you might do a full scope 3 screening, but the requirements are a little bit looser there than what it are for enterprise. And we have talked a lot about absolute and an absolute pathway. The Science-Based Target Initiative have some sector-based tools. There are some being developed at the moment, and some are already available. So if you are, for example, in the financial institutions, you're probably waiting patiently for some sector guidance to come out. And the latest we've heard is that they're coming out in September this year. But there are also some for the power, iron and steel, cement, aluminium, pulp and paper sectors as well. So if that's something that you want to do, I would say go in and read the guidance there. But if you're not a business, I would say go in and have a look at the guidance still and set your targets align with the guidance, but do not submit to the Science-Based Target Initiative. Their website has a very good register of organizations that have set targets already as well. So I find it a very good place to find inspiration on what your target might be, what others have done. And even when you as a consumer want to go in, you can have a look at what organizations have set science-based targets. They often have very sophisticated sustainability reports, so you can get some more information on what they're doing to reduce their footprints. A few other links here to some resources. We can of course help you with setting a science-based target. Majority of our help comes into the scope 3 screening part. That is a bit of a time-consuming activity, but we can also help in getting your target ready for submittal. Have a look at the Ministry for the Environment's guidance on how to put an inventory together if you haven't gotten to that stage just yet. If you want to learn more about scopes or you want to understand what the supply chain categories are, have a look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And don't forget that if you are thinking about setting a science-based targets, I would recommend you download the guidance from the Science-Based Target Initiative, and you have that as your bedtime reading for a couple of weeks. And that's a really good start to get your head around some of the ins and outs of setting a science-based target. And I'm going to stop talking there and leave it up for people to put in your questions. So if you do have any questions, just please pop them into the question and answer section, and I'll attempt to answer those. While I'm getting that up, I can also I guess I could cover some of the questions that we usually get. One of the most common ones as well is that if I want to submit to the Science-Based Target Initiative, do I have to have my base year verified? And the question is, no, you don't, but you might, your inventory might get scrutinized to a larger extent if you have not had it verified. And I would certainly recommend that you do have a verified base year if you are setting a target, just to make sure that you know that you've calculated things right from the get-go. So because of course that base year is what you're going to measure your progress and reductions over time against. So getting the base year correct is strongly recommended. And I've got a question here, what the main difference between the greenhouse gas protocol and the ISO standards are. Very good question. So the ISO standard sets minimum criteria for how you should develop your greenhouse gas inventory, whereas the greenhouse gas protocol is a little bit more of a, I guess, a guide document, and it's a lot bigger and thicker document, and it's got a lot of more scenarios described, whereas the ISO standards, well, it's a standard and it has the minimum criteria. So, for example, organizations won't verify to the greenhouse gas protocol, but you can get your inventory verified to the ISO standard. They are very similar when it comes to how to classify emission sources, and there's often quite a lot of overlap. So for a lot of organizations, if they have verified their inventory to the ISO standard or developed it aligned with the ISO standard guidance, then they are very often aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol as well. And last note on it, the big difference is how you categorize your scope 3 emissions. So those are the main differences. Also, greenhouse gas protocol is freely available, whereas the ISO standard is a paid standard. So that's just useful to know as well. And I should also note that if you are submitting to the Science-Based Target Initiative, a lot of their references and guidance refers to the greenhouse gas protocol rather than the ISO standard. So that's just useful to know as well. Another question that we often get is if you can set an intensity target and what we think about intensity targets. And the short answer to that is yes, but you want to make sure that your intensity target still leads to absolute reductions in the long term. And so what we would recommend is that you look at your intensity measure. So that might be square meters or per output product or per full-time employee. But you also look at, so you can look at what your pathway is, what your projected growth rates are, but also look at what the projected emissions will be over time. And you want to make sure that when you are calculating your intensity target, that those intensity targets do lead to absolute reductions over time. So I guess from an internal perspective in communicating your targets, it can quite often be useful to talk about them from an intensity perspective to make them a little bit more tangible. And another question that we have is in terms of COVID, and what do we do if we want to set a target that's based on the current financial year. Say, for example, you're on a 1st of July to the 30th of June timeframe. So for organizations that are looking to set a target now, you obviously have a few different options. If you're keen, you can say, well, we don't want our carbon emissions to go up any more than what they were in the COVID-19 year. Other organizations might also want to consider an average of, say, 2 or 3 years as their base year. So you're essentially just averaging out your base year over a few years. You could also, of course, consider using a base year that's pre-COVID, and then, because of course, then you can understand a little bit better of what the impact of the COVID lockdown has been on your business and in terms of emissions. I see here there's a question. If most of your emissions come from a fleet, are there other options rather than upgrading to electric vehicles? Yes, of course. I mean, you could look at the most obvious one, and when you look at a preferred pyramid, is of course reduce the use altogether. We are working with a lot of organizations with quite large fleets and where they're leased. So the recommendation would be to engage in conversations with your lease company and see what the options are. I would also recommend you look at it from a long-term perspective, and also look at what makes sense. Have we got any vehicles that are coming up for renewal in a couple or more years, and does it make sense to do changes then? And one main thing as well, I should say, around electric vehicles is that it is quite popular to potentially start with one vehicle, realizing that not all vehicles might be fit for purpose if they're electric vehicles in an organization, but you might have some vehicles that will and some that won't. And one way to I guess build acceptance of electric vehicles in an organization is to try one, and that might be a vehicle that you're using in a different setting than, for example, long distance off-road driving. So I hope that answers the questions. Nadine, did you want to jump in with something? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, if anyone's got any more questions, it's send them through. Or otherwise, if you think of something in the future, you're most welcome to get in touch with us directly, and we